The name of this segment, or part one, is what I call Understanding the Big Picture. And so today is really about the basics, if you will, of sustainability. We're going to get into much more of the specifics in future classes, but let's begin with a basic definition, because a lot of people talk about sustainability. It's a very common word today. And I just want to be sure we understand what it really means. So sustainability, as you can see, I think this is the best definition I've seen from the United Nations. And it basically means this: all of us at some point are going to die. When we die, the world that we leave to our children and our grandchildren, is it equal or better than the world that we currently inhabit? And the reality is, if we hand them a broken world, a world that is damaged because of our activities, then we have not lived in a sustainable way. So that, I think, is the best way to think about what is sustainability. You also can see below the Sustainable Development Goals, which were put together by the United Nations in 2016. There are goals laid out for 2030. Frankly, the goals are not on track right now. But if you look at the 17 of them, and you can kind of go across here and think about how many of those do we chefs interact with on a daily basis, by the food that we cook, the people that we serve, the food that we buy, interacts with so many of these. We have a very pivotal role. So where are we going? This is kind of the roadmap for the next 7 days. And it goes like this. We have taken sustainability and we have divided it up into 7 categories. Now, the 7 categories are a little bit, let's just say they're all interrelated, but we had to cut them up into pieces so we can kind of deal with them. So the first one, which we're going to do today, is what's called Understanding the Big Picture. Then we're going to move into agriculture, so the food that comes from the dirt. And then we move into agriculture part 2, which is animals as food. Then we move into seafood, and then we look at energy, water, and waste. Interesting, in all my discussions with chefs, many times the focus is squarely on food, but we can't only talk about food and not look at energy and water and waste, because they all intersect. Now, one of the things that you may be, when you look at this, you may say, well, there is a piece that's missing here. And the piece that's missing is really the social piece, the social items surrounding this. And it's missing on purpose, simply because we couldn't fit it in, and those topics are very big. But even though they're not here, they're still incredibly important, and at some point we'll probably be addressing that. But it's really issues about, who does the work? Is it fair? How are they treated? Are we helping to create or continue cycles of poverty, et cetera, et cetera? These are big topics and worthy of discussion, but they're not going to fit into what we're doing here today and in the subsequent days. So this is where we're going today. So this is part 1. Our roadmap is really about, let me just move something here on my screen, there we go, is really about looking at the big picture things. How did we get here? When I started cooking, which is now 4 decades ago, the word sustainability didn't exist. Nobody in the kitchen said, talked about sustainability. We assumed there would always be enough food, enough water, enough energy, and that garbage was never a problem. But the reality is, now we know that that was an incorrect way of thinking. So we're going to look at the issues surrounding this. Why is it that, for instance, we talk today about these issues? What is it about sustainability? Then we're going to talk about sustainability in food service. Where does that intersection happen? And then we're going to get into some basic sustainability concepts that will apply to every day after this. And then lastly, we're going to look at how culinary schools and the industry are responding currently to sustainability issues. So I think it'll be eye-opening for all of you. So let's look at kind of the big macro picture. And in sustainability education, it's very important to look at the macro picture. what is the big picture? Why are we here? So the first thing is, problem number one is population. We have more and more people growing at a faster rate in the world. And if you just look at those numbers, you can see how quickly those numbers are expanding, and that we're adding billions of people from, basically from 2020 until 2050, which is only a 30-year stretch. We're looking at putting in about 2 billion more people into the population of the world. And that creates serious stresses on the system. So population is number one. And we have to remember that we human beings, we have not been around for all that long in terms of the history of the world. So things are happening very, very quickly. And earlier when I said we have to jump into action, it's because of this, partially. So why is the population expanding the way it is? Now, a lot of people say, well, it's because we're having lots of babies. Somewhat, that's not necessarily the whole sort of explanation. It's really a much more complicated picture. And it has to do with some of the bullet points that you can see on the left of your screen. It's about the fact that we're able to produce more food, and we will see a little bit how much food we have been able to create over the last 40 to 50 years. We have increased public health, which then, that means, safer water, better shelter, understanding disease, better medications, etc. So people are living longer. So we have this population explosion also because people are living longer. And infant mortality has gone down. And again, we have longer lifespans. So that's, and of course, in certain parts of the world, we do see an expanding population also because of high birth rates. Across the world, not always necessarily the case. So it's a very complicated picture as to why there are more and more people on the face of the earth. Okay, so problem number two is one of consumption. So we have a growing population. There are more and more people on the face of this planet, and more people who are consuming more and more things. So you can kind of see from this graph where we talk about quote unquote developed countries. And I should say, myself living in the US, I look at this and I see that little dot at the top that says USA. That's not a badge of honor. So the reality is that we are consuming, in the more developed countries, more and more resources. And so what does that mean? I mean, if you think about even the fact of what's a kind of throwaway society that we live in, how many times have you changed your cell phone? How many times have you changed a computer? What happened to the old one? And when we talk about greater amounts of waste, and we're going to look at things like food consumption and how that has also changed. The internet, which is wonderful to be able to do things like this, also helps push consumption on a global basis. And that's something that we never had to deal with before as a species. So let's move on to that. So that just gives you a little bit of a sense for what's happening in the world in terms of consumption levels. Now this is maybe even more eye-opening, because if everyone lived like an American, remember on that last slide that the US was way up in that top corner, the reality is that we would need 4 planet Earths to support that style of living for everybody. And what this really points to is a couple things. Number one, it points to a gross inequality of consumption across the face of the earth. And that is something that we have to look at and we have to deal with. But in addition to that, I guess I would ask the question, should people be looking to the US and to some of the developed countries as that's the goal of where they want to be? This is not a sustainable model, and the way that we are living is not a sustainable way of life. And then, of course, we get into some of the issues that are very challenging, and that is, disparity from a nutritional standpoint. Now, before I get into this slide, and we're going to talk about the Eat Lancet report that came out last year. We're going to talk about that in future classes, because really what it pointed out, and something that a lot of us have been seeing, is that sustainability and nutrition are actually linked. And in other words, if I'm living in a sustainable way, I also tend to be living in a way that is good for me personally from a nutritious standpoint. Now, we can see across the face of the earth from this slide that we have massive disparity when it comes to nutritional not having enough and overconsumption. So for instance, if you look at this, 11% of the total world's population are chronically undernourished. 11%. That is not a sustainable model. And it's especially not a sustainable model when you look to the right and you look at the amount of overconsumption or overweight people who are consuming more calories than are needed. It's a very unequal and untenable world. If you look at the fact that 2 billion people are overweight in this world, that points to massive inequality that needs to be addressed. So let's move to another topic here, which is climate change. And climate change is an interesting piece here, because remember, on the one side, you have a growing population. You have a growing population that wants to consume more things. And then we layer on top of that climate change. Now, if you look, this is great evidence in terms of where are we going. And you can see that all of a sudden that line spikes up very, very quickly. And if you look at the statistics of where we are going from a global warming standpoint and from a climate change standpoint, the issue is that this is related to human activity completely. We are the last 4 years, from 2015 to 2019, were the hottest years on record in a row. Last year was the hottest year on record. There's been a lot of discussion about how much can the world warm up before the serious problems ensue. And where scientists pretty much fall is something along the lines of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but even going from 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, the results are monumental, and they're monumentally bad. What's really interesting, and by the way, when we talk about what 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, that's above pre-industrial levels. So if you think about like the year 1900, where we are today, we are at 1 degree above that. So we've already gone a fair distance, and we're already starting to see some of the effects of climate change on the world. If we go above 2 into the 3 range, the effects are absolutely catastrophic. So that's a real warning for us. Now, what is climate change? Climate change is basically the result of various gases that get into the atmosphere. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's carbon dioxide, methane, etc. Remember, nitrous oxide is important, and also remember methane. Methane, we're going to get to that mostly in the last day when we talk about waste. But it's a really important gas that has dramatic effects, negative effects on the climate. Now, this is where things get challenging. So what happens when we are effectively warming up the world? What is the result of that? It's not just that the world gets warmer, but what happens as a result is very, very troubling. The first is that weather patterns get completely unpredictable. And we're seeing that already, great rainstorms and drought and flooding in one part of the world, and then it's drought in another and fires in another, but it's not predictable. Now, the problem with that is that when we look at agricultural production, much of the world's agriculture is based on models that are very that have very predictable weather patterns. The minute you start to disrupt that, what happens is it's harder and harder to grow large amounts of food. Now remember, growing population that wants more, but now it gets harder to produce food. We're damaging ecosystems dramatically. Extinctions are dramatic. We talk about, rising sea levels. That is actually a real serious threat, because if you look around the world and you look at where the major population areas are, many of them are on the coasts. And if the sea levels begin to rise, you can't stop the water from inundating cities, and that becomes problematic. Acidic oceans, we're going to talk about that when we get to our seafood part of our seafood day number 4. Acidic oceans are very, very detrimental to the ecosystems within the ocean, which basically means it damages fish stocks. Now remember, growing population, more consumption, and less fish. So this is a major, major problem. And of course, we look at where is the water, available. If we have weather patterns that are unpredictable, that also means the amount of water that we have is unpredictable. It depends where it is and when. And things like glaciers that many populations of the world, they rely on glaciers, snow and ice to form in the winter and then run off all through the year to provide fresh water. If those start to become in trouble and get smaller, which they are, we are looking at serious water shortages in some parts of the world that have very high and dense populations. So this is kind of where things get really challenging. And if we think about, how do you feed basically 10 billion people by 2050? How do you do that? Because what that requires, it requires an increase of food of 56% more than what we're producing today to feed the population. To do that, you need a much greater land surface. If you are farming the way we do today and producing food, it requires basically 2 areas of land the size of India to produce more food. The problem is that land doesn't necessarily exist, and that land is subject to climate change, which will affect growing areas. And of course, a lot of that then is met with deforestation, which has a detrimental effect on climate change. So it's all wrapped up together. These are the challenges we have. And of course, how do you produce more food without the land to do it, and then also producing significantly less greenhouse gases? This is the problem effectively that is at our doorstep. Now, we chefs, we have a part of this, but it also goes beyond us as well. And I just want to say, when we go back to the power of the white jacket, we have power also to affect things like policy, and because we can, get to people who are in power who can affect those decisions. So, scarcity of resources, this is where eventually it all goes, okay? Because we have more people, they want more stuff, it's getting harder to produce it. And now what happens? Well, we have shortages. And shortages, can we produce enough food? Is there enough space for animal protein? What about, fish and shellfish? How are we going to do that? And then we get into issues of, water and energy, which we're going to look at on subsequent days. How do we do that? Is there enough water for everybody? Clean, potable water? Is there enough energy for everybody to do what they need to do? And there's a wonderful quote here from a gentleman by the name of Julian Cribb, who wrote an incredible book called The Coming Famine. And this is really, we are at that moment as a species where we have to act together. It doesn't work if one country does it and one doesn't. And I say that sheepishly from the United States, but don't worry, the rest of the world, things will change here too. Scarcity of resources. The reality is that everything is interrelated. Remember earlier I said we're going to look at this from 7 days, 7 topics that are artificially separated just to be able to study them. But the reality is, and we'll see this throughout these subsequent days, it's all connected. You know, water is needed for every part of life. You know, energy is needed to grow food, to cook food. It's all absolutely connected. How we deal with waste directly affects climate change, which then directly affects how much food we can grow, etc. It's all connected. And so we are in what is called the perfect storm. We are in, you know, we have to change the way that we do things. It's inevitable. And by the way, if we don't choose to change them now, we will be forced to change them later, but that will be difficult. So in terms of food production, this is, you know, this is complicated, and we're going to look at food in depth for the next 3 days, because food production actually has increased. And interestingly enough, if you look at sort of the average, you know, calorie intake that's needed, you know, for, you know, healthy people, it's roughly 2,600 for men, roughly 1,800 for women. So as you can see, we're producing enough food to feed the planet right now. Now that's right now, but the reality is that's going to grow. And then, as you can see, the issues are way more complicated, because even though we produce the food, as we'll see on day number 7, we lose a lot of the food due to waste. We have issues of distribution, transportation, you know, and as we saw today, gross inequality in terms of how much food is available in certain parts of the world versus how little is available in other parts of the world. And then, of course, you layer on top of this climate change, and you look at that number of calories per person per day that we're producing, and you ask yourself the question, can we sustain that? And can we even increase it? And that's the challenge that's in front of us. So, excuse me. So what does the future of food look like? Now, this is, you know, the kind of scary information, which we're going to cover more in depth, is, you know, if we look at, for instance, just some basic figures over the last 100 years, you know, 75% of plant genetic diversity has been lost, you know, as farmers have, you know, basically moved to genetically uniform, high-yielding varieties. 30% of livestock breeds are at risk of extinction. 6 breeds are lost every month. 75% of the world's food is generated by only 12 plants and 5 animal species. 75%. So we only use about 4% of the known edible plant species that are out there. Literally, there are hundreds of thousands of edible plants, and we really only eat from about 150 to 200 of them. So, you know, does that matter? Well, it does, because if we're trying to deal with things like climate change, where maybe the way we've always done stuff isn't going to work, we need to have biodiversity, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, in our tool bag to be able to find crops that work, find animal breeds that will suit new or changing, you know, climate realities. I think about, you know, for instance, there's a grass that we're working with here called kernza. And it's basically, you know, kind of a wheat grain, if you will, grass sort of. But what's interesting is that it grows for 5 years versus every year. And you know, that was kind of going back and looking in seed stocks. Or if I look at something like the fonio grain from West Africa, you know, that's not really known throughout the world, but incredibly drought resistant, hardy. You know, these are plants that we need to have in our tool bag. So what does it look like as we go forward? Because chefs, this is going to be our world. We're in the world of cooking food. And so what does it look like for us as we think about how do you produce the food, and what is the food that's going to be available to us? Now, one thing I know about chefs is that we're incredibly flexible and that we're incredibly resourceful. And so we'll be able to adapt to some of these new foods, but it's coming. You know, urban agriculture is coming. It's here. You know, food produced in high-rise city buildings is something that architects are working on fervently right now. You know, hydroponics, aquaculture. We're going to address aquaculture on day number 4 in detail. We're looking at, you know, meat made in a science lab, what's called cellular agriculture. Not just meat, but other products as well that we can produce from, you know, yeasts and bacteria growing stuff for us. Sounds unusual, but we'll have a lot of mouths to feed. And then, of course, you know, seaweed and algae is going to be another big, you know, food as we move forward. And already there's very interesting things happening in the world of algae and, you know, oil production, etc. That's happening. So stay tuned as this happens. Insects, you know, will be another big one. And a lot of people will say, I don't know if I want to eat insects, but even insects ground up as flour or insects that are used for animal feed may be a much better way to go than what we're currently doing today. So now we kind of transition a little bit. So I gave you the big picture stuff. You know, why are we all here? Why are there 1,000 people on this particular communication? And I think we have to address the big issues, but then we also have to bring it down to us. You know, why is it that chefs are concerned about, you know, sustainability? What is the intersection between sustainability and food service? I mean, clearly the White Jacket, we have the power to change the world, but there's also another layer here. And that is that we in food service, it's all about sustainability. I mean, if we go back to what I call the sustainability equation, it's about food, it's about energy, water, and waste. What do? We buy a lot of food, we cook a lot of food, we send messages back through the food service or the you know, the food channel back to the farmers and the producers about what kind of food we want them to produce and grow for us. We use a lot of energy, more than any other industry basically per square foot. We use more energy. We use a large amount of water, and we produce a lot of waste. So we have a very particular responsibility to sustainability. And that's why I'm so passionate about this, because we have the power with the White Jacket, and we also have the power to change the world by what we do every day. Now, the good news here is that within the world of sustainability, there's a lot of stuff happening right now, a lot, way more than we have time to even look at in these next days. There are a lot of people very much trying to figure out how to solve this issue. And within the food service world, it's kind of funny, when I started talking about this 20 years ago, people thought I was crazy. And today, there's a great demand for sustainable restaurants, sustainable hotels, sustainable food service in general. Our customers want it, and it's the right thing to do for our businesses. So, you know, what do we see today? Well, you know, this is just a little list of what food service is doing. They're demanding they're demanding change, and we see food service, you know, chefs, etc. You know, like all of you today, taking the time to learn about how to do things better. And that is incredibly, incredibly encouraging. Incredibly. So I'd like to jump into some basic sustainability concepts as we kind of get to the close of today. And these are things that will be seen again as we go through the next number of days. And the first is that sustainability is a journey. It's a journey that never ends, and it's a journey made up mostly of baby steps. And what I mean by that is, you know, doing something is better than nothing. It may seem inconsequential. It may be some little thing that you decide to do in your personal life or in your professional life. But those little things all combined across the face of this world will change the world. And what we've noticed is that when somebody does one little thing, they tend to do another one, and then another one, and all of a sudden that journey begins. And we're always then looking for ways to improve how we do things from a sustainability standpoint. Secondly, is that nobody is perfect, and we all make mistakes. and we all have to learn. And so this is something I think that's very humbling. Nobody is ever, quote unquote, sustainable. There's always so much more that we can do. And so as we go through this, I encourage you to remember that and not to be discouraged, because sometimes, you know, it may be discouraging, but keep pushing ahead. The world needs us. Education is key. Now we're doing that today and for the next 6 days. But many of you interact with other chefs, other cooks, chef associations, schools, culinary schools. Please spread the word. It's so critical that we do that. And lastly, that sustainability is very diverse and very complex. I mean, if you think about all the different parts of what sustainability is, it's about knowing food and how it's raised and how animals are raised and how fish is grown and, you know, energy and water. There's a lot there. So it's very important to continue to learn. It's very important to find resources that you can always sort of go back to as references, because chefs are busy. I understand that. We're all very busy. But nonetheless, we can still work on doing things better. Couple more concepts. This is a critical one. If we are working with sustainability, we must think about sustainability from a long-term perspective. If we're looking for small decisions, we tend not to make sustainable choices. Many times it's easier to do things and not be sustainable, but I encourage all of you, think about the long-term problem, because sustainability, we didn't get here, yesterday. This is a problem in the making, and it takes time to fix it. And we'll see some examples of this where small, decisions that were short-term decisions were taken instead of long-term thinking, and that's many times detrimental. And then lastly, you have the power, and I can't emphasize this enough. For everybody on this Zoom webinar, you all have the power. Whether you're a student, whether you're an executive chef running 20 restaurants, whether you are running the kitchens of 100 hotels, all of you have a responsibility, and each one of you has the power to change this world that we live in. Never forget that. So just to wrap up here, I spent 20 years in culinary education, and I know that in many schools around the world, sustainability is being taught. And I just, go through this very quickly, but there's so much that's happening within culinary schools to address the issues of sustainability. And it's incredibly, it's incredibly heartwarming to see that. And then lastly, we can see some examples of some of the things that culinary schools are doing, because it is truly incredible, the creativity that's happening there. And you can take a moment to look at that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in just a moment. And I want to, first of all, congratulate all of you. Let's see, I can stop share right now. Excellent. I just want to congratulate all of you on taking the time to be with us today. And I hope that you have found this to be inspirational. I hope that you stay with us for the next 6 days, because we have so much more to talk about. And I just very much want to thank all of you. You are a real inspiration to me.